If you're looking to fix your pelvic tilt, whether it's anterior or posterior, then watch this video because you're gonna learn what might actually be more important than achieving the perfect pelvic tilt alignment. Welcome, Coach E here from Precision Movement, and today I've got a really important video for you, whether you've got an anterior, posterior pelvic tilt or not. And if you've got low back pain, this is really important for you as well. Before we continue, join the 600,000 plus others who are interested in moving freely and without pain by tapping on the subscribe button right there. And that way you can continue to get our exercises and notifications of all our content so you can join us when we're old and gray and still doing the active things we love. Now, if you've got a really glaring anterior pelvic tilt, which is sticking your butt out like you're going for those likes on Instagram, or posterior pelvic tilt, which is like you got caught doing something bad and now you're sticking your tail between your legs, check out the videos we've got for you linked right up here. These are older videos, are the best places for you to start if your issues are very, very glaring. But if you've just got a slight anterior posterior pelvic tilt, or you've got a neutral pelvic tilt, then definitely check out these exercises right now and do them because they're gonna help you to develop control and stability of your pelvis and your lumbar spine from the inside out. And when you have that control and stability from the inside out, then when you use the big muscles like the glutes to move around and to sprint and do all those active things that you love to do, you've got that stability so that the pelvis stays healthy and the lumbar spine stays healthy. Now, before we get into the exercises, one little note for low back pain sufferers. I classify low back pain in a few different ways, but the two most common are flexion-related dysfunction and extension-related dysfunction. If you've got flexion-related dysfunction, this tends to happen when you bend over to tie your shoes and you throw out your low back. That is the most common type of low back pain. And for you, you want to bias yourself to a slight anterior pelvic tilt posture. If you've got extension-related dysfunction, then standing for a long time might be irritating, or walking might be irritating, whereas for flexion-related dysfunction, walking tends to make the low back feel better. For you, you want to bias yourself to a slight posterior pelvic tilt, so tucking that tail between your legs. But regardless, for everybody, we've got to do the exercises here to develop our control and stability of the pelvis and lumbar spine for a lifetime of doing the active things we love. So let's get to it right now. Exercise number one to learn to control and stabilize your pelvis is the 4-point pelvic tilt. And the reason why we're doing this is to develop the kinesthetic awareness of what it feels like to tilt your pelvis anteriorly and posteriorly, and the muscular control to do that. For this exercise, you're in the 4-point position here. And we want to focus on the lumbar spine and the pelvis. So anything above my hand here, so thoracic spine and above, we don't really worry too much about what's going on there. Get into a comfortable 4-point position. If your wrists bother you, you can go on a little stool and just put your forearms on that stool there. But get into position, and all you're doing is slowly going into as much anterior pelvic tilt and lumbar extension as possible. Hold it briefly at the end range, and then going into posterior pelvic tilt and lumbar flexion. And then hold it briefly at the end range. Now, the muscles that you'll be using to do anterior pelvic tilt are around the low back here, the lumbar extensors. And for those of you who have been following us for a while and have greater control of their bodies, the iliopsoas, specifically the psoas aspect. And the muscles to go into posterior pelvic tilt are the abdominals and the glutes. So you're just going back and forth from anterior to posterior pelvic tilt, holding briefly at the end range, not really pushing the end range of motion right now. And you're doing about 6 repetitions. Now, for those of you who have low back pain, if you've got the flexion-related dysfunction, don't go into too much posterior pelvic tilt. I want you to bias and focus more on the anterior pelvic tilt and the lumbar extension. For those of you who have extension-related dysfunction, don't go into too much extension. Stay more neutral to posterior. And that way, you'll start to restore and train your body to keep the bias that you need for your body. Exercise number 2 to control and stabilize your pelvis is one of my unique dissociation techniques. And the dissociation techniques I've developed to break typical habitual movement patterns that when we do them over and over leads to pain and injury. In this case, the movements that we're dissociating or breaking are the movements of hip flexion, that's flexing the hip, the angle is closing here, and posterior pelvic tilt and flexing the lumbar spine. This is what typically happens when people lift their knee up. You could try it yourself right now. Don't think about it too much and just try to lift your knee up as high as possible. You might notice you get into a subtle posterior pelvic tilt. We don't want that. The other movement that we're breaking here is hip extension, like when we're running, and lumbar extension and anterior pelvic tilt. If you run a lot and you sprint a lot and you got powerful glutes and you're throwing that leg back to propel yourself forward, you can run into extension-related dysfunction and low back pain because of it. So we're gonna break these common habitual movement patterns with this dissociation hip and pelvis technique. For this technique, I'm not worried about balance so much, so you can put your hand on a wall like this or 2 hands facing the wall. Those are both perfectly fine. You're standing up tall, and what you're gonna do is I'm gonna get you to start by tucking your tail between your legs, and then as you lift the leg, you're going to go into an anterior pelvic tilt. So you start tugging the tail, and then you lift the leg, and you see I'm going into extension and anterior pelvic tilt, sticking my tail out. Again, getting those likes on Instagram. Hold that for 5 seconds, knee is relaxed, ankle's relaxed. I'm working the iliopsoas here. And from here, I'm gonna go into hip extension and then posterior pelvic tilt. So I'm gonna tuck my tail and flex my lumbar spine a little bit. And see, that's as far as I can go when I have this posterior pelvic tilt and lumbar flexion. Here, you'll feel the glutes working. Hold for 5 seconds, squeeze that muscle. Try to get deeper into the range. Here we're stretching the hip flexors, which is also a good thing. And then we go back into hip flexion, anterior pelvic tilt, lumbar extension. Hold for 5. You could press a little bit to get a little more out of the iliopsoas here. And then hip extension, posterior pelvic tilt. Holding for 5. And that's how you do it. Do all the reps on one side, then you switch over, and you're gonna train that pelvic control, and you're gonna have the ability to maintain stability through the lumbar spine and through the pelvis as your hip is moving through its full range of motion between flexion and extension. The third exercise I've got for you today isn't very fancy. It's really simple. There's not much to see. It's called the standing glute contraction. Here, what we're doing is we are going to start the movement with the feet, and then we go to the deep pelvic floor muscles, then we layer on the glutes. Now, what we want to make sure we don't do is move the knees and rotate the hips at all. We want to keep this start position with the feet pointing straight ahead, my weight evenly on my heels and my toes, and even from the outsides of my feet to the insides of my feet. So if my foot's a rectangle, the weight is distributed evenly around the box. You want to keep your weight even. You want to keep your knees pointing straight ahead, and you want to keep your pelvis level and not opening up the hips, opening up the pelvis. You start off at the feet. So you start off contracting the deep intrinsic foot muscles. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, click the video up here to get the lowdown on the intrinsic foot muscles. But basically, we're trying to make the foot short and skinny. You make it short by pulling the forefoot towards the heel, and you make it skinny across the metatarsals. That's the knuckles of the foot. So short and skinny foot, also known as the active arch. Fire up the foot muscles. Then you go pelvic floor. To get the pelvic floor on, pretend you're peeing, and then you stop the pee midstream. And then you think of also pulling into the pelvis, so pulling everything into the pelvis. From here, you probably already have your glutes on. Just contract them a little bit more up to the maximum level that you can. Once you hit that max level, you're holding for 10 seconds, you're breathing naturally. Keep everything relaxed from the pelvis up. So everything there is relaxed, everything you're and below is tense and contracted. And when I'm done this exercise, after 10 seconds, I gradually let everything go. Don't let everything just fall. Then we're training that ability to vary your contraction intensity. So that's another skill that we can develop. Again, it starts with setting up in good alignment, feet are pointing straight ahead, feet are right under the hips, and my weight distribution is even left to right, front to back. Get my feet on, get the pelvic floor on, think of stopping pee midstream and pulling everything into my body, and then squeeze the glutes as hard as I can without rotating the knees, without losing position. Hold that for 10 seconds, keep breathing relaxed naturally, and keep the low back muscles, the abs, as relaxed as possible. Shoulders, neck relaxed. When you're done, gradually let everything go. And there you have the standing glute contraction, and that's going to help you to develop that stability from the inside out. The foot muscles are connected to the pelvic floor, and if we don't have good pelvic floor contraction, anything we do with our glutes, hip flexors, glute medius, these muscles are going to be doing their jobs on an unstable platform, an unstable pelvis. So that's why this exercise is so important. The fourth and final exercise to develop control and stability of your pelvis, I call the Slumpy Hip Hinge. And it's similar to the dissociation technique that we used before, but now we're gonna develop control and stability of the pelvis in this fundamental movement pattern, which is the hip hinge, where you're tilting over at the hips. The knees aren't bending too much. You're tilting at the hips like a deadlift in the gym. Now this concept, this slumpy concept I use with many different exercises, it can also be applied to squats, so you could try that. But right now we're gonna focus on the hip hinge. For this technique, you start off in the slumpy posture. So posterior pelvic tilt, tuck my tail between my legs and just let my back flex and round. From here, I want you to get that glute squeeze that we just worked on in the previous exercise. So squeeze that glute, get the pelvic floor on, and don't lose it. Keep those on the whole time. From here, you go into anterior pelvic tilt as you start to hinge over like you're doing a deadlift on the way down, a Romanian or stiff leg deadlift. Keeping that pelvic floor and the glutes on, and then maintain neutral pelvic tilt as you come up to the straight position. So at the top, you're not in that posterior pelvic tilt, you're neutral pelvic tilt. Glutes are on, pelvic floor is on, and then let everything go. What a lot of deadlifters do, guys in the gym lifting heavy weights, is they'll deadlift, and at the top, they'll push the hips forward, go into posterior pelvic tilt to try to get lots of glutes. But what happens here is you're holding 200, 300, 500 pounds, who knows, and you're in a lumbar flexed position with the posterior pelvic tilt. That's going to wreak havoc on the lumbar discs, and that's when we can get into herniated discs, blown discs, and a lot of pain and heartache after. So again, what we're doing here, get into slumpy position, rounded back, posterior pelvic tilt, get my pelvic floor and my glutes on and keep them on the whole time. Then I go into that anterior pelvic tilt as I hinge over, go as far as I can, keeping the pelvic floor and the glutes on. You can tap on the glutes to make sure they're on as far as you can, and then you come up, keeping everything on into the neutral position, not posteriorly pelvic tilting, but neutral, not letting the knees turn outwards, and then you let it go. So let me give you that front view. So slumpy posture, pelvic tilt, keep everything on, coming up, not turning my knees out, evenly distributed on my feet, heel to toe, left to right, or middle to outsides of the feet, and then let everything go from there. There you have the slumpy hip hinge, and there you have a great way to start to restore one of these fundamental movement patterns that we use in everyday life to pick things up from the ground, kids, groceries, whatever it is, and to move about and do what you got to do. To recap the little routine we just went through, we started with 4-point pelvic tilts. You could do 6 reps there. Then we moved to the dissociation technique for the hip and the pelvis. Do 2 sets of 4 reps per, and holding each for 5 seconds. Next, we went to the standing glute contraction exercise. Do 1 set of 5 reps, holding for 10 seconds once you get everything on. And we finished off with the slumpy hip hinge. Do 2 to 3 sets of 4 to 6 repetitions. So there you have a little routine to develop control and stability of your pelvis for a lifetime of moving freely and without pain. Let me know what you thought about this video in the comments down below, or just tap a like or dislike if you didn't like the video. And for other resources for you, got a few things. The older videos for anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. And most importantly, if you have any pain around the hips or the pelvis, get the Hip Pain Solution program. It's a progressive approach that utilizes exercises and concepts like I've taught you right here, but progressed over many months to make sure that we hit all the bases to keep you pain-free.